Wir gehen zum nächsten Vortrag und ich darf Ihnen Herrn Stephen Sholly, Bachelor of Science in Science Education, kurz vorstellen. Er ist wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter am Institut für Risikoforschung. Stephen Sholly hat am Shippensburg State College in Pennsylvania in den USA studiert und in Geo-Environmental Studies graduiert. Er befasst sich seit 1979 mit Gefahren- und Sicherheitsanalysen, Risikoabschätzungen und Umweltverträglichkeitsanalysen im Zusammenhang mit nuklearen und auch gefährlichen chemischen Anlagen. Er hat unter anderem auch Unfallanalysen für das Los Alamos National Laboratory des US Department of Energy erstellt, und dass es dort um die Produktion von Nuklearwaffen geht, weiß man. Stephen Sholly ist seit 1988 in Österreich und arbeitet, wie gesagt, am Institut für Risikoforschung der Universität Wien. In seinem Vortrag befasst er sich jetzt vor dem Hintergrund der Nuklearkatastrophe in Japan mit Entwicklung und Analyse eines nuklearen Unfalls. Accident Progression, auch sein Vortrag ist in englischer Sprache und ich darf Herrn Sholly jetzt bitten, hierher zu kommen. Bitte sehr.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have a lot of material to cover, so I will try to move semi-briskly through it. If you have a critical question, please put your hand up and stop me, because questions sometimes are very difficult to keep in mind through the course of a 20-minute presentation. For such a technical presentation, I think you're entitled to know what my background is. I've spent 33 years on nuclear issues, including 10 of them largely on General Electric boiling water reactors. I have rather extensive experience in probabilistic safety assessment and severe accidents, and I have to emphasize this last item. The opinions I express here are solely my own. Nobody else is necessarily going to subscribe to them. This gives you an idea of how the Fukushima site looks. The first 4 units progress to the south, units 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then these are units 5 and 6. In between is a dry spent fuel storage facility, and behind these units is a common wet pool storage facility for the 6 units. This is a cutaway likeness of a Mark I boiling water reactor containment. Containment consists of 2 main structures: the dry well, which houses the reactor itself, and then the suppression pool, or torus, which is sometimes called a wet well. This is a suppression chamber that is connected to the dry well.
Excuse me very much, I have to interrupt you because they are recording. If you're away from the microphone, there is no recording.
It's difficult to show people the structure.
Yeah, so
I'm almost done. Surrounding these 2 compartments is the reactor building. This is not a hermetic structure. It's designed to gather any leakage from within the first 2 structures. And it channels these gas releases through a standby gas treatment system. You'll find this is the structure up here, which in the 3 units that exploded, these 2 levels up here are what disappeared. This is a cutaway line drawing of the same structure. You can get an impression of what it looks like. from the bottom of the dry well on down is typically below grade. So that only from here up, approximately, is the above grade structure that you see. Okay, a few slides about the main safety features of these plants. There are two steam-driven cooling systems. In Unit 1 at Fukushima, which is a BWR3 Mark I design, they have high-pressure coolant injection and an isolation condenser. Isolation condenser is two liquid-filled chambers. The steam released from the reactor is channeled through the isolation condenser. The steam condenses, cools the liquid down, and recirculates it back to the reactor. This is essentially a passive system. But it does require that some valves be open and remain open in order to function. There is, in the BWR4 Mark I design, and this is units 2 through 5 at Fukushima, they have a reactor core isolation cooling system. This is a steam-driven system, as is the high-pressure coolant injection. Both essentially passive. Again, they require at least battery power to make sure critical valves are open. The low-pressure emergency core cooling systems are both motor-driven. They are the low-pressure core spray, which sprays water from a bunch of spray nozzles arrayed around the top of the reactor vessel. And there is a low-pressure coolant injection, which injects into the recirculation loops. You have emergency diesel generators. These provide power if the station is separated from the electrical grid and can no longer rely on off-site power. Essential service water is very important. This cools heat exchangers, it cools the water-cooled diesel generators. It's the connection between the nuclear units and the ultimate heat sink, which in this case is the Pacific Ocean. You have a residual heat removal system, which functions as part of the low-pressure coolant injection. This removes heat from the recirculation system and can also spray water in both the dry well atmosphere and the airspace above the suppression pool. Automatic depressurization system is a subset of the safety relief valves that can be actuated to open and depressurize the reactor. These valves require DC power, battery power, in order to open. If you lose battery power, the SRVs won't function. The primary containment, both the airspace above the wet well and the dry well, are inerted with nitrogen gas. This takes the oxygen concentration down below 5% and thereby prohibits combustion of combustible gases like hydrogen, like carbon monoxide. There is an alternate injection capability. When the reactor is depressurized, you can inject by hooking up a cross-connect between the fire protection system and the low-pressure coolant injection. This can also be supplied with water from a fire truck. And at the Fukushima station, there were 3 such fire trucks. You have a hardened containment venting. Containment venting is very important in the Mark I and Mark II design, for that matter. The physical size of the containment is very small compared with a large dry containment pressurized water reactor like Temelin. If the suppression pool begins to boil, it's no longer suppressing steam, it's no longer condensing steam, and the containment just pressurizes. You need to get rid of that pressure so that the containment doesn't fail. If you open up a series of valves from the airspace above the suppression pool through to the vent, which directs the water, or directs the steam rather, to the plant vent, you can reduce the pressure considerably, and the only radioactivity that's going to get released is a small amount of the particulate forms like iodine, like cesium, and most of the noble gases. That's much better than having the containment physically fail and have a release point to the environment. So hardened containment venting is very important. There is a spent fuel pool cooling system. When this system doesn't function, the residual heat removal system can be switched in to cool the spent fuel pool in an emergency. One important feature here at Fukushima is shared control rooms. Units 1 and 2 share a common control room. Units 3 and 4 share a common control room, and units 5 and 6 as well. And there are pictures online where one side of the control room has power and is illuminated, and the other side's in darkness. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Okay, the situation before the accident. Units 1, 2, and 3 were operating at full power. Unit 4 was shut down, and the entire core inventory of fuel rods had been lifted out and removed to the spent fuel pool, a so-called full core offload. This puts a rather large heat load on the spent fuel pool, one that's atypically large. And it requires typically both trains of spent fuel pool cooling or assistance from the residual heat removal system to remove enough heat and keep the water temperature down. At the time of the accident, TEPCO was the 5th largest electric utility company in the world by sales. No longer. Take a quick look at the initiating events. The first initiating event was a magnitude 9 so-called megathrust earthquake. This is along a plate boundary where one crustal plate is going under another. There was motion on about a 400-kilometer long segment of this plate, and that's what caused the large earthquake and also the displacement of the water that caused the tsunami. At the time of the earthquake, off-site power at Fukushima was lost from all 6 sources. All of them went down. So now you're in a situation where the diesel generators have to start up. There were 12 diesel generators available. 1 was in maintenance. All of them started up successfully. As you see at the bottom there, a substation 10 kilometers from the plant was severely damaged by the earthquake. And when the electrical grid got power back 50 minutes after the earthquake, power was still not available to the nuclear plant. Now, the next important initiating event was, of course, the tsunami. The earthquake produced 7 tsunami waves, the largest of which flooded the site in about a minute, 4 or 5 meters deep. And that's 4 or 5 meters above the local grade level. All of the seawater pumps or surface water pumps were destroyed, so there's no connection now between the plant and the ultimate heat sink, the Pacific Ocean. The diesel generator fuel tank for units 1 through 4 was destroyed, so you have no fuel for the diesel generators. Only 1 of the 13 diesels survived, and that was an air-cooled diesel at Unit 6, and that kept that unit, and also by sharing power with Unit 5, kept that unit as well from having a severe accident. There were additional failures. Units 1 through 5 were in station blackout. At the time the tsunami struck, the isolation condenser at Unit 1 was shut down, which means valves were closed. Unit 1 lost its diesels, it lost its batteries, and the valves failed as is. In other words, they failed closed. So the isolation condenser is no more available. You have no heat removal from that source. At later times, the reactor core isolation or RICSI pumps failed due to battery depletion and other causes, and you're left without injection. Containment venting was attempted very late due to the difficult conditions in the reactor building, debris all over the place. And since core damage was underway by the time they were able to get portable air sources to open valves and portable batteries to read instruments, high radiation levels at that point complicated things further, and it just led to more and more delays in venting the containments. This is a general depiction of accident progression. You either have a loss of heat removal or a loss of coolant or both, and the coolant that remains in the reactor vessel begins to boil off if you have no recovery of safety systems. The fuel rods, as they uncover, begin to heat up. The cladding, the zirconium cladding on the outside of each fuel rod, begins to oxidize. And this oxidation is a metal steam reaction. It oxidizes the cladding and releases hydrogen. And this is where the hydrogen came from that exploded in the units. You get a gap release. This is the release of radioactivity that's in the gap between the fuel pellets and the fuel cladding. This releases, it's the first release. It's about 5% of the core inventory of the particulate material and most of the noble gases. You get further heat up, eventual melting and slumping of the fuel, additional hydrogen production, and in-vessel release, which is a greater percentage of the particulates. As the melt descends into the lower parts of the vessel, there's a great deal of water below the core support plate in a BWR. You can quench the core debris, but if there's no more water forthcoming, this water too will heat up and boil, and eventually you have core debris against the vessel head. And if that lasts long enough, the vessel head will fail. Okay. If at the time vessel failure occurs, the reactor vessel is at high pressure, core debris is sprayed into the dry well. It's a very dangerous condition. The heat from the core debris is given up very rapidly to the dry well atmosphere, and this can lead to severe overpressurization and failure. If the vessel is at low pressure, the core debris pours and slumps out of the vessel. If the core debris leaves the reactor cavity and contacts the side wall of the dry well, that can induce melting of the metal on the dry wall, and you can get a release that way. In any event, once core debris leaves the vessel, it's contacting concrete in the reactor cavity and the dry well. You get chemical reactions between the core debris and the concrete. This produces hydrogen. It produces carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, and you get this ex-vessel release from gases bubbling up through the core debris. It's possible, although unlikely in the Mark I design, that you get melt through the dry well and deposit core debris in the lower level of the reactor building. I say this is not likely because there's several meters of concrete depending on which direction the core debris goes. And typically the severe accident codes predict that the core debris will react with the concrete, dissolve it, it becomes less and less concentrated and eventually solidifies. This is a rather rough depiction of what I just told you. You can see the progression across the top. Unfortunately, this diagram is of a PWR in the upper section, but it gives you the rough idea. You get core heat up, you get core degradation, and then the hotter part of the core begins to melt and slump downward. The bottom four are specific to a Mark I containment, and it shows again, the core melt progress, the pressurization of the containment, and then leakage of the containment with the resultant release of hydrogen to the reactor building. The general belief except at TEPCO and the Japanese nuclear regulatory authorities, is that all 3 reactor vessels failed. And you have what is euphemistically called core on the floor instead of core in the vessel. Units 1, 3, and 4 reactor buildings, not the primary containments, but the reactor buildings surrounding them, were destroyed by hydrogen deflagration or detonation. There is a dispute about where the Unit 4 hydrogen came from. Did it come from Unit 3 through the standby gas treatment system ductwork, migrate over to Unit 4 and into the building, or did it come from oxidation of fuel in the Unit 4 spent fuel pool? I don't think the Japanese government and TEPCO's explanation that it came from Unit 3 is credible. First of all, Unit 3 reactor building detonated 19 hours before Unit 4 had its hydrogen explosion. When Unit 3 hydrogen detonated, the piping connection to the standby gas treatment system was totally destroyed. No additional hydrogen, therefore, could come from Unit 3 to Unit 4 after that point. The Unit 3 hydrogen detonation was sufficiently violent that it damaged walls at Unit 4. If you know anything about hydrogen, it's very easy to initiate hydrogen combustion. Static electricity discharge can cause a hydrogen burn. Given the violence of the Unit 3 detonation and the damage at Unit 4, if there was a lot of hydrogen, or at Unit 3, if there was a lot of hydrogen in Unit 4, it would also have burned then. But there was no burn at that time. There have been calculations done of the Unit 4 spent fuel pool that estimate that hydrogen production would have started at about 9 o'clock on March 14th. This is hours after the Unit 3 hydrogen detonation. About 35% of the fuel in the Unit 4 spent fuel pool would have been oxidized. You would have also had gap release from this fuel. The production of the hydrogen from this amount of oxidation is by far enough to destroy the Unit 4 reactor building. And it is believed by some sources, myself included, that this is what happened. And I think I would invoke Occam's razor. If you look at a picture of the arrangement of the buildings, and I'll do this at the end of the presentation, you'll see it's a very complicated scenario to imagine that this hot, light hydrogen gas is going to go down, migrate across the yard, through pipework, through a rather complicated arrangement of piping and spread into Unit 3, when the combined stack for Units 3 and 4 is right there. It's a big, huge stack and has no resistance to flow. If anything, if there's any hydrogen going out that way, it would have gone up the stack. There were 3 saving graces in this accident. One is Japanese government initiated evacuation relatively early. The close-in population was evacuated particularly early, and the later evacuations out to 20 kilometers saved a lot of exposure that could otherwise have happened. Saving grace 2, the units are beside the sea, and the winds were blowing out to sea during much of the Unit 1 and 3 accident progression, but not for Unit 2. And you've probably seen photographs or maps of the deposition, and you see a large plume of radioactive material that goes to the northwest. That was from the Unit 2 accident progression. So it could have been much worse. And finally, seawater injection, and later freshwater injection after additional fresh water was brought to the site, finally ended the attack of core debris in the dry well floors, and the use of concrete pumping trucks reflooded the Unit 4 spent fuel pool and terminated that accident. These are the core inventories for Units 1 and 3. Unit 2 would be very similar. Unit 4 has roughly the Unit 3 inventory plus the cesium inventory of an additional 783 spent fuel assemblies. So there was quite a lot of cesium in the Unit 4 spent fuel pool. I'm not going to go over these source term estimates in detail, but these are from quite a variety of different sources. You can see the comparison to Chernobyl. And also here is an estimate of the release from Errico Pizzoli from Unit 4 spent fuel pool. Errico did accident progression analyses for the Swiss Nuclear Regulatory Authority. If he's correct, these releases qualify independently as an NS level 7 release on the spent fuel pool. Balraj Sigal, who is also a very knowledgeable individual, works at KTH in Sweden, did a more or less worst case estimate of what would have happened if units 1 through 3 went through accident progression without mitigation. And you can see he comes up with a higher source term, which would have been about twice as much iodine as the Chernobyl accident, and about 10 times the cesium. So Fukushima, as bad as it was not a worst case accident. Not by a long stretch. Two messages on the source term. One, why are TEPCO's source terms lower than everybody else's? And I'll go back and you can see. They have the lowest estimated source term of all of the estimates that are out there. The other thing I find curious is, apart from the Japanese government, why is no other nuclear regulatory agency estimating source terms? NRC didn't, the British Nuclear Regulatory Authority didn't, the French didn't, nobody. They don't want to, they're scared, and this fits in with Yuli Andreev's perspective. And as I pointed out, as bad as it was, it could have been a lot worse. There are some similar, but not identical, European plants to Fukushima. There's a BWR-3 Mark I at Santa Maria de Garoña in Spain. There's a BWR-4 Mark I at Mühleberg, and there are BWR-6 Mark III units at Cofrentes in Leibstadt. I've listed the other BWRs that exist in Europe. These are not similar except in concept to the BWR-3 and 4 Mark I units. I also list the VVER-440 units. And the way they are similar is both in terms of pressure suppression and the way the units are configured with an end cap at the refueling deck, which is very similar to the BWR Mark I units. During refueling, there is no containment. The containment is open. That's true for the Mark I units. It's also true for the VVER-440-213s. I have to note that Mühleberg and Leibstadt have double containments, and they have filtered venting systems, and they have additional bunkered safety systems, so they are not nearly identical with the Fukushima units. Gundremmingen B and C also have double containments and filtered venting, and the Swedish BWRs all have filtered venting systems. Just a proviso, so you understand they are not the same. I have two other things I want to talk about briefly. Cold shutdown. On December 16th, the Japanese government and the IAEA and TEPCO all announced that cold shutdown conditions had been achieved at Fukushima. This is sheer howling nonsense. Cold shutdown is very specifically defined in the technical specifications for these units. It requires the operation of 2 trains of residual heat removal, 2 trains of service water, and also the availability of a reactor coolant pump. None of these systems are available at Fukushima any longer. And by definition, therefore, cold shutdown's impossible. I understand what they're driving at, that the temperature of the water covering the core debris is below boiling. Fine, then say so, but don't call this cold shutdown. That's misleading, and it's technically inappropriate. Now, last question. Was Fukushima a black swan? Nassim Nicholas Taleb describes black swan events as an outlier outside the realm of regular expectation. It carries an extreme impact, and in spite of its outlier nature, human nature makes us concoct explanations for its occurrence after the fact. So, was Fukushima a black swan? I would say no. It was predictable. Indeed, it was predicted by TEPCO in terms of the tsunami height in 2006 and 2008, and by others in 2001. The Japanese Nuclear Energy Support Organization clearly understood by December, a few months before the accident, that if you flood the site 14 meters high, you have essentially a 100% chance of a core melt accident. And that would not be at one unit, it would be at everything that's operating. So they knew, or should have known. There was also geologic and historical evidence of past large tsunamis that you simply can't ignore. These were collected, and an estimate was made that the frequency of earthquakes large enough to generate a large tsunami was about once every 30 years. So this should have been an expected occurrence, but it was not. Both TEPCO and NISA, the regulatory authority, ignored these cliff edge effects, and the result was the accidents. The earthquake and tsunami did have extreme economic impacts, but they were not black swans. A multi-unit nuclear power plant accident triggered by external hazards should not have been a surprise. You can see the list of things that have already happened that have affected multiple units. PSA studies have been done highlighting this potential. This was not a surprise, or should not have been. The last item I will point you to, and I will read this. The 2010 Japanese Nuclear Safety Convention report stated that in Japan, it's possible to reduce the potential for the occurrence of a severe accident to the extent that its actual occurrence would be technologically inconceivable, and to maintain the risk of nuclear installations at a sufficiently low level. Similar statements were made in their CNS reports in 2001, 2004, and 2007. As far as I've been able to determine by talking to people that were at those meetings, nobody questioned the Japanese on this technologically inconceivable statement. In my experience in 33 years, you rarely see such technological arrogance as that. I want to point out, in concluding, we're only 1 year after the accident. We have a preliminary understanding, but things can change. Remember that in the case of the 3 Mile Island accident, it was more than 5 years later before it was confirmed that the core melted. Until then, it was widely believed that the core did not melt. More than half of it did, but this wasn't known until 5 years later. We're at the 1 year anniversary, so there can be surprises. Keep your eyes open, you'll see them. I have heard estimates that they'll have Fukushima cleaned up and closed down in 10 years. This is nonsense. It took almost 10 years to clean up 3 Mile Island, and the core debris was retained in the vessel. Here, I think you have core on the floor. Okay, that's it. I have the list of the main reports. If questions come up later about the accident progression in any of the individual units, I have timelines for the 4 units, and we can refer back to those. Thank you.
Thank you, introduction of how the accident progressed. Vielen herzlichen Dank, Stephen Sholly. Zwei wichtigste Botschaften. Es hätte noch schlimmer kommen können und was geschehen ist, war natürlich aufgrund der Geschichte und der großen Anzahl an Naturkatastrophen in Japan durchaus vorhersehbar.
Steve, I think it's not yet clear if the earthquake was the dominant threat, reason to the failing of the nuclear power plant, or the tsunami. When you think, I looked at the records from the beginning, and I realized that from the beginning, water level records in the reactor pressure vessel of units 1 and 2 and 3, they were down. So it seems that the earthquake already destroyed pipes or something like that, so that no water could be accumulated in the reactor pressure vessel to cool the core. And this threat was strong enough that obviously also the containment failed, because we found the radioactive water flowing to the turbine hole where the pumps afterwards took suction.
We should give him a chance to answer. Okay, so let's collect the two questions and then I ask Mr. Sholly for their answer.
Actually, it's the same question. And just adding one fact is that in Unit 1, when workers tried to approach the outside of the containment, the double doors on the outside, the radiation monitor went off scale and they had to leave. And this is before the tsunami hit. So it's between the earthquake and the tsunami that this evidence is recorded. So it's my same question.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Just in addition, it was measured at one of the radiation measurement point, I think number 4, increased radiation level before tsunami.
Okay, as far as the last 2 points are concerned, I haven't seen this information, so I really can't comment on it. In terms of what was the source of the main damage, you need to understand that the BWR emergency core cooling systems are not designed initially to fully flood the reactor vessel. RCCI, in particular, the reactor core isolation cooling system, typically only refills to about the 2/3 level of the fuel assemblies. They rely on steam rising above that to keep the fuel assemblies cool and wait for LPCI, the low pressure coolant injection system, to come on and fully flood it. In this case, I don't think LPCI came on at any of the units. And Unit 1 doesn't have this function. They have the isolation condensers. In terms of equipment operability, as far as I have been able to determine, and I've looked at all of the major reports that came out, just about everything I could get my hands on, it seems to me that most of the equipment was operating up until the tsunami hit. The diesels were running, the emergency core cooling system pumps were running, the batteries were all operable. Everything was working well with the possible exception of the isolation condenser, and that was shut off by the operators at least 3 times before the tsunami hit. And in fact, it was shut down at the time the tsunami hit, and when the tsunami hit, it wiped out not only the diesels, but the batteries for Unit 1, and the isolation condenser couldn't function anymore.
What about the water level records?
Well, the water level records are probably accurate. It doesn't, the RCCI does not cover the full core. It only recovers it to about the 2/3 or 3/4 level, something like that.
The whole period, they were at the same level.
Yeah, because nothing, LPCI didn't come on. And HPSI didn't come on. You didn't get the water level or pressure down low enough to initiate these systems, and the operators didn't turn them on. So it was going solely on automatic response. You need to keep something in mind about a big earthquake like this. Operator response after a big earthquake is not very good. This has been noted in fossil-fired plants that have experienced earthquakes and also in the few occasions where nuclear units have been involved. Operator response is not very good for about the first hour. That's understandable. The big earthquake, they're concerned about their families as well as about the power plant. So their attention's not entirely on what's going on, and their ability to process new information is not as good as it normally is.